what I will cover now is more of the evidence of what are some of the effects of or correlations of economic growth with environmental and social indicators. But Jordan is going to cover the policy aspect afterwards, okay? And we don't have so much time, so I will go over my slides a bit quickly. However, if you have any questions or I'm speaking too fast or something is not clear, don't hesitate in raising your hand and asking me any questions, okay? Great, so as you've seen in some way, or maybe you know, the current economic model and political model that we have is mainly centered in economic growth, okay? The idea that we can keep growing the economy year after year and there's no end in sight. But what is economic growth? So Andrew covered part of that. It's basically the market value of all the final goods and services that are produced in an economy. So it's everything that is counted in the market and it's measured in a dollar value or a monetary value. And you probably know that economic growth has a major role in government policy. So many governments are elected under the promise of more growth. They also promise jobs and other things, but growth is really something very central in how we elect our governments. And they are assessed, in how is the economy doing, is it growing, is not growing. And growth, as we saw, I think, in the debate also, it is seen as this holy grail to solve many of our complex problems. So it is seen to solve, poverty. If we have more inequality, then we may need more growth. It's seen as the solution for unemployment and creation of jobs. It's the way in which the government raises taxes. And these are just some examples of the promise that lies behind economic growth. And according to this historian, McNeil, he said the overarching priority of economic growth was easily the most important idea of the 20th century, okay? And it is still a very important concept in the 21st century. But what is the rate of growth? So the global average of economic growth in all economies is about 3.5%. And this is considered to be moderate. It's not very high. So, but you have different countries that grow at different rates. So we have China and India, for instance, that grow at 5%, whereas the US is now expected to grow at 2.9%. Yes?
Is this yearly?
This is every year, yes. So this is what we expect the economies to grow every year, year after year, okay? And the US is expected to grow at 2.9%. And according, for example, to the International Monetary Fund, this is a modest rate of growth, so it's not really high. For instance, in 2013, when Canada grew at 1.7%, that's considered very mediocre. It's like very tiny rate of growth. But the question is this really so tiny? Like, what is the nature of economic growth? So, economic growth is exponential growth. And I guess many of you here know this. So this is just a chessboard, and I'm just going to illustrate very quickly in some way how does exponential growth works. So imagine that we are putting a grain of rice in the first square, and we duplicate this grain of rice, the amount of grains of rice every square. So then we have 2 grains of rice, 4, we have now 8, 16, 32, then we will have 64, and if we keep duplicating, we will have 128 by the 8th square. How many grains of rice do you think we would have by the 16th square? Any guess?
1 million. I don't know.
Okay, so maybe not so much, 30,000. And by the 24th square, about 8 million. And by the 40th square, we will already have trillion grains. And we don't even want to imagine what we will have by the 64th square. So this is the idea of exponential growth. Numbers become very big, very quickly. And something that is really interesting, according to this physical scientist, Al Bartlett, he said, the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. So really, it seems our brains are not wired to really understand this. Like, even though that I've seen it, and I really don't grasp it. It's a complex thing. So economic growth, as I said, is a type of exponential growth. So imagine this is the human economy in 1960s. It grows at 3% a year, which doesn't sound a lot. But if an economy grows at 3% a year, it duplicates every 20 years, 23 years. So by the 1980s, we will have already double size of the economy. And then if it grows maybe a bit higher, 5%, 7%, it will duplicate every 10 years. So by the 90s, we have one doubling, and then 2000s, we have another doubling. And the question is, how many times more can this physical, material economy expand in a finite planet? And the question here, and the issue here, is that the economy is not expanding in a void. It's not expanding into empty space. It is expanding into something else. And as Andrew explained, there are trade-offs, and we need to know what are those trade-offs, and do we really want to keep going? Are the trade-offs worth? So just to show you the exponential function, this is the US real GDP growth, so it is adjusted to inflation. And you can see very clearly this is an exponential line, okay? And it grew from in the 1800s, so this is the past 200 years, from less than, probably a couple $billion to now $16 trillion. And something that is really interesting, this graph is only the last 200 years. I want to show you how is this graph if you take a broader perspective of a few thousand years. So this is a graph from basically the last 2,000 years. And you can see that growth has been pretty steady. Maybe until the 1500s, 1600s, it started picking up a bit. And then it's really until the 1850s, the 1900s, that it really spikes. And something that is really important, and I think this is the take-home message in general, is like we take growth for granted. We think that it's the most normal thing, and if we stop growing, we will die. But the reality is that growth is an anomaly in human history. This type of growth, we have never experienced it before. Okay, so it's not a normality, it's rather an anomaly that we are experiencing now. And it's very important to see what are other exponential trends that have grown with economic growth. So here you have in this graph, like it's very general, but it's loss of rainforest, we have exploitation of fisheries, water use, carbon dioxide emissions. So you have a lot of other trends that have grown exponentially as well. And the question is, how are we doing? So are we in a sustainable path? Are we unsustainable? So according to many scientists, humans are on an unsustainable path. We have been in ecological overshot since the 1980s. But what does ecological overshot mean? It basically means that we are using more that can actually be regenerated in the planet. Okay? And according to the ecological footprint, the ecological footprint is a very good measure, I think, of our demand on the planet. Okay? And it basically measures what is the amount of productive land that we will need to maintain our consumption. So the ecological footprint will tell me, okay, you consume this amount of crops, let's say 1 hectare per year. Oh, you consume this amount of meat, so you will need 0.3 hectares of cattle to sustain your consumption. It also calculates how much forest, for example, I will need to plant to capture all of my carbon emissions. So it basically tells me, in a unit of land, how much land do I need every year to sustain my current consumption. Okay? And the great thing of the ecological footprint is that you can calculate it on an individual level, country level, or planetary level. So in the world, we know that each person in the planet, in average, uses 2.7 hectares per person, but the average biocapacity, which means the capacity to provide goods and services, is only 1.8 hectares per person. So there is this deficit of 0.9 hectares. But how is it possible that we are consuming more than what we have? So the idea is that if you see here, we are consuming 1.5 planets. So I will make the comparison with a bank account. Rather than living off the income of natural capital and letting the natural capital regenerate so that we can live off that income, we are basically consuming our capital. So it's like having a bank account. Rather than living off the income of your bank account, you are using the capital. So yes, we can have amazing lives and they are great and we have so many things, but eventually that capital is going to run dry. And that is exactly what we are doing with the planet. We are overusing the resources not allowing them to regenerate, and we are crossing our fingers that we will maybe find other moons, other planets, where we can keep finding resources because we're depleting the resources that we have here. And just to give you an idea, Canada's ecological footprint is 7 hectares per person, which means that if every person in the planet would consume like Canadians, we would need 4 planets. So, yeah. Another very important research is the research of planetary boundaries. So, what these scientists are trying to see is what is the safe operating space for humanity to keep the Earth system in the current state it is now. So humans have been able to thrive in the past 10,000 years, mainly because we are in the Holocene, and it has been a great era for humanity to thrive. And what they are trying to see is like what changes we do to the Earth system that may put us at a greater risk of moving into a different state of the Earth, and a state that is unknown for humans, okay? And they have selected 9 very important dimensions, and what they are showing is that we have already crossed 4 very important boundaries. So one of the boundaries is climate change. Here you can see that we are in the yellow. It means like we are at a risk of really changing the planet to a state that we haven't seen before. The other one is related to genetic diversity, which is biodiversity loss. The other one is a change in land system, which is related to deforestation and loss of forests, and also altering the biochemical flows, specifically related to phosphorus and nitrogen. The most important of these, of all of these, are climate change and biosphere integrity, because many of the other processes depend on having the climate and the biodiversity that we have now. So these results are really dire. Like they're like not so positive, but it's a warning in some way that something needs to change, and we need to figure out what should we change. Okay, so yeah. And the question is, are we in denial as a species? Yeah, and I think that's a very typical response that I get. Okay. Okay. So then the next question is, now that we have had so much economic expansion and we have, so many of these things, are we better off? So GDP, as an indicator of economic growth, has many limitations. So basically, it doesn't differentiate between costs and benefits. So if you have, probably most of you know this, if you have an oil spill and we pay for cleanup, that is accounted in GDP and is accounted as growth, although our well-being hasn't really increased. Non-monetary aspects are not accounted for. So if we have very healthy people that don't need to go to the hospital, that is not accounted in GDP, whereas if we have a lot of sick people that needs to pay for hospitals or doctors, that is accounted in GDP. So it really doesn't make this difference between what is really a benefit and what is really a cost. Also, it doesn't account for distribution of wealth. We are becoming richer, but how is that wealth being distributed? One of the key questions in ecological economics is, are the costs greater than the benefits? And ecological economists differentiate between having economic versus uneconomic growth. Has anybody here heard the concept or the idea of uneconomic growth? Yeah, for me it was like, can you have growth that is like not economic? Well, yes, you can. So uneconomic growth is the idea of having growth that has more costs than benefits. How is this possible? This is possible because in our accounts, we are not accounting for the costs. We are only accounting for the benefits. So we don't really see those costs. And many ecological economists would argue that we are now in a period of uneconomic growth, where having more growth is actually making us poorer rather than richer, in the short and in the long term. Okay? So the final question is also, are we confounding means with ends? Is economic growth the end, or is it a means to something? And if it is the means to something, are we really getting to that something? Or maybe somewhere in the way we get lost and we keep, confounding these means with the ends. And the creator of the GDP said almost 100 years ago The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. But it seems that's exactly what we tend to do. Like, we just equate growth with well-being. One of the important key points also is the idea of diminishing marginal returns to growth. So growth does generate benefits and it increases our satisfaction. So in this side you have happy life years. This is a measure that accounts for life satisfaction and life expectancy. And here you have GDP per capita. So and each dot is a country, okay? So you have some countries that really have very low GDP, very low income, and really they are probably not happy countries. But as soon as you have some gains in income, you can see, wow, happiness really increases with, minor increases in income. But then there's some point, maybe it is, $20,000, $30,000 a year, where really that line basically, gets stagnant in some way. It doesn't keep increasing with GDP. So what this is showing us is that you get the greater benefits of growth at the beginning. And this is an example that you can have in your daily lives. If you are really, really hungry, the first bite of pizza or sandwich that you have is so delicious. It generates so much well-being. But if you keep having more sandwiches or more pizzas, eventually your well-being starts to diminish, and eventually you will really get, a decrease in utility and even, reduce your well-being. So this is exactly with the idea of diminishing marginal returns. The great thing about this is that this is showing us that you have countries that can have very high quality of life, happiness and well-being, without very high levels of high GDP. So there is an optimal point where we can maximize the benefits of economic growth while we can minimize the costs. And the important thing is, where is that point and how do we get to that point? So moving beyond GDP, ecological economists have worked in different indicators. The genuine progress indicator. Have anybody here heard of the genuine progress indicator? Great. Okay, so GPI is a more comprehensive measure than GDP, so it tends to differentiate between costs and benefits, and it accounts for ecological degradation, for example. And what they are showing is that in the United States, while GDP has grown exponentially, actual genuine progress peaked in the 80s, and it's now even declining. So we are not becoming better off. And in 2013, a study, this is globally, they did the same thing in the whole planet. And they are showing very similar results. GDP per capita keeps growing exponentially. However, genuine progress isn't really growing, and it already peaked. So this is really food for thought to see if we need to use better indicators. So just very briefly, I'm going to introduce the idea of the steady-state economy. So the steady-state economy is one, I would say, of the most important ideas, maybe, of ecological economics, and a specific proposal of an economy that doesn't need economic growth. So the idea is to have a constant stock, of built material and a constant stock of people, okay? Based on the flow of natural income that we have from the natural capital, okay? So it really is an economy that takes into account how much nature do you need to sustain this type of economy. Something really important in the idea of the steady-state economy is that we are talking here about material aspects, non-material aspects, quality of life, social connections, many other things can grow indefinitely. So the fact of having a stable production of goods and services doesn't mean that our quality of life is stagnant. We can become very happy and maybe much happier than now if we are not so focused in just producing and consuming all the time. And finally, the idea of post-growth economics, so moving beyond consumption-based indicators of well-being. And this is a big one, focusing on qualitative development rather than quantitative growth. So ecological economists really differentiate between becoming better rather than becoming bigger. And what they would argue is in the current economy, we are just becoming bigger, right? We're just producing more because we need to produce more, and that's what we measure, and that's the most important thing. They would say, like, having more is not necessarily becoming better. So we need to be more qualitative in some way. Rethinking and redefining progress. So what is progress? What do we value? Do we really value having the latest car, or having more stuff, or the latest iPhone, or do we value something else? We can generate thriving economies that are aligned with nature and that don't need growth. So an economy that doesn't have growth doesn't mean that it has to be a stagnant economy or that it has to be a depression. You can have thriving economies that don't need this continual expansion. And also the question is this an inevitable future for economies? If there are limits to growth, which it seems there are because the planet is showing some signs, we will have to do this transition anyways. So the question is, are we going to wait and maybe have a collapse and plan collapse, or are we going to really see the evidence and make the decision of really transitioning into something different? So it's a choice that we have, and as a species that can plan ahead, that's the hope, that we will see these signs and maybe decide to transition into something different. Okay? That's it. I'm so sorry for
yeah. That's it.